They called him Android at Apple because he was obsessed with robots, and that nickname, given to him inside Apple's walls in 1989, would eventually become the name of Apple's greatest enemy. Because after learning everything he could at Apple, he used those lessons to build something that would dominate the smartphone market, something Apple never saw coming. Today, my friends, we're diving into one of the most insane stories in tech history. How Apple accidentally trained the man who built Android and dominated the smartphone market. The year was 1989. Andy Rubin was on vacation in the Cayman Islands, soaking up the sun, when he noticed a guy who looked completely miserable. The man's name was Bill Caswell, and he'd just been thrown out of his room after a fight with his girlfriend with nowhere to stay. Rubin barely knew this stranger, but he did what most people wouldn't and offered Caswell a place to crash for the rest of the trip. They hung out, talked tech, and when the vacation ended, Caswell asked Rubin a question that would change everything. Want to work at Apple? This random act of kindness landed Rubin a job at one of the hottest tech companies on the planet. But what Apple didn't know was they'd just hired the man who would eventually build their biggest competitor. But before we continue, a quick message from today's sponsor, Incogni. Your personal information is exposed online right now. Your address, phone number, email, even details about your family members. It's all published on hundreds of websites for anyone to find. And the consequences are real. Criminals use this information for scams, stalking, and illegal activities. Your home address and phone number are exposed, so stalkers can easily locate you or your family. Even employers, landlords, and complete strangers can access your personal information. While you can technically ask them to delete your data, doing it manually would take you hundreds of hours because there are thousands of websites constantly selling your information. That's why I use Incogni. Here's how it works. You create your account, authorize Incogni just once, and they automatically track down and remove your information from over 420 data brokers and people search sites. Since this information can reappear, Incogni sends repeated requests to keep it off permanently. But here's the best part. With the unlimited plan and custom removals, you can go way beyond that. Found your information on a specific website? Just copy the link, send it to Incogni, and a dedicated privacy expert personally handles removing it for you. You can submit an unlimited number of links, new sites, public databases, directories, practically any site exposing your data. It's the most complete way to disappear from the internet. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code BYTE, B-Y-T-E, at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Go to incogni.com/byte. A huge thanks to Incogni for supporting the channel. Rubin started at Apple in 1989 as a manufacturing engineer. The company was riding high on Macintosh success, and Rubin threw himself into the work. But his co-workers noticed something weird about him pretty quickly. He was obsessed with robots, and it showed in everything he had, like his house, which had a retinal scanner instead of a doorbell. If your eye wasn't in the database, you'd have to ring the actual bell, which was a robotic hand holding a hammer that struck a gong. This wasn't normal behavior, even for Silicon Valley. So his Apple co-workers started calling him Android, and the nickname stuck. Rubin didn't mind it at all. He actually loved it. But working on the factory floor wasn't enough for Rubin. He wanted to build the future, and in 1990, Apple was about to give him that chance. In 1990, Apple spun off a new company called General Magic, which Rubin joined immediately as they were working on something revolutionary. The vision was to develop handheld devices and communication technology, but they wanted to do more than just make calls. It would have apps, cloud storage, and internet connectivity. Sound familiar? They were building the smartphone 15 years before smartphones existed, complete with an operating system called Magic Cap that had apps and cloud storage that sound normal today but were pure science fiction in 1993. Rubin and his team poured everything into it. They believed this was the future, but they just had one problem: nobody else did. Hardware makers looked at Magic Cap and passed because the technology was too advanced for 1993. At the same time, Apple released the Newton PDA in 1993, which got way more attention, but still flopped. Both failures showed that the world wasn't ready for handheld computers yet, and by 1995, General Magic, the company that wanted to invent the future, was under severe financial pressure, marking the start of a downward spiral because they were too early. But Rubin learned something crucial from the failure. He knew exactly how to build a smartphone. He understood what worked, what didn't, and what the world would eventually need. After General Magic failed, Rubin decided to leave Apple, co-founding Artemis Research, and built WebTV, a system merging television with the internet, which Microsoft bought in 1997. Suddenly, Rubin found himself working for Microsoft, and he hated every second of it. The corporate bureaucracy crushed him so hard that by 1999, he quit and decided to bet on himself one more time. This time, Rubin founded Danger Inc. and was determined to get it right. He built a device called the Sidekick, which had features that were unheard of at the time, like apps, cloud storage, and it put the internet in your pocket years before the iPhone existed. To get it to market, he partnered with T-Mobile, who sold it as the T-Mobile Sidekick. The device became a massive hit with young people, and two guys at Google were paying attention. Larry Page and Sergey Brin became obsessed with the Sidekick because it used Google as a default search engine, putting Google search in people's hands wherever they went. They'd remember Rubin in time to come. For now, Rubin had finally proved his vision worked. He'd created a hit product. Danger Inc. was successful and everything was going great. But the T-Mobile partnership came with a serious cost. Because T-Mobile was selling the device, they controlled everything. What features were allowed, how it was branded, who owned the customer relationship. Then Danger's board made it worse by pushing Rubin out as CEO, bringing in someone with more telecom experience. By this time, Rubin was done playing by other people's rules. He needed to build something nobody could control, and that's when the bigger vision hit him. What if he built an operating system that wasn't controlled by any single company? An open platform that anyone could use, manufacturers, carriers, developers, something that would make it impossible for anyone to lock him out again. In late 2003, Rubin left Danger and founded Android Inc., with 3 partners, naming it after his old Apple nickname. But Android wasn't originally designed for phones at all. Rubin and his team wanted to create an operating system for digital cameras. Their vision was to build cameras that could connect to computers and cloud servers, automatically storing and syncing photos through an Android data center. In 2004, they pitched this idea to investors who weren't buying it because the digital camera market was already declining. Everyone could see that phones were getting better cameras and standalone cameras were becoming less relevant. Rubin realized they needed to pivot fast. So 5 months later, they abandoned the camera idea and focused on building a mobile operating system to compete with Nokia's Symbian and Microsoft's Windows Mobile. Rubin believed there was a huge opportunity to create smarter mobile devices that understood location and user preferences. Here's what made it different. Android would be completely open source and free for anyone to use. There was just one problem. Android Inc. was completely broke. If you're enjoying this story, by the way, please hit that subscribe button. It's much appreciated. By 2004, Android was on the verge of disappearing, a situation that seemed to confirm what everyone was saying: no one could compete with Apple. The money was gone, the rent unpaid, and the landlord was threatening to evict them. But Rubin wasn't willing to give up. He knew his vision, an operating system that would challenge Apple, was worth every effort. Desperate, he called his friend Steve Perlman, the same guy he'd worked with at WebTV years earlier. Perlman went to the bank, withdrew $10,000 in cash, and handed it to Rubin just to keep the office. The next day, he wired over more money to keep Android alive because he believed in Rubin's vision, even when nobody else did. With this lifeline, Rubin kept building the prototype. But Android still needed more funding, and Rubin decided to try Samsung. In 2004, Rubin flew to Seoul with a team of 8 people, walking into Samsung's headquarters to pitch their vision for an open mobile operating system that would change the future of tech. When they finished presenting, the room went silent before Samsung executives started laughing. They thought the whole idea was ridiculous, believing Android had no future, and showed Rubin the door. But in just 2 weeks, everything was about to change. Rubin needed a miracle, and 2 weeks after Samsung laughed him out of their boardroom, he got one. Larry Page and Sergey Brin agreed to meet him at Google's Mountain View campus. Page remembered Rubin from his Sidekick days and praised that device as one of the best phones ever made, while Brin asked technical questions about the Danger OS. They talked for hours, and the meeting ended with handshakes, but no promises. Rubin went back to his dying startup and waited. 45 days later, Google called again and asked to see the Android prototype. This time, when Rubin and his team showed what they'd built, Page and Brin saw something Samsung had completely missed. They weren't just looking at a standard mobile operating system. They understood that mobile was the future, and whoever controlled the mobile operating system would control access to billions of future users and all their searches. So on July 11th, 2005, Larry Page made a decision that would reshape the entire tech industry. He didn't just invest in Android, he bought the whole company for $50 million. He was so sold on the idea that he didn't even tell Google's CEO, Eric Schmidt, until the deal was already done. 50 million sounds like a lot, but compared to Google's other acquisitions, it was nothing. Because just over a year later, Google spent $1.65 billion to buy YouTube, and in 2011, they dropped $12.5 billion on Motorola. But that $50 million bet on Android would become Google's best investment ever. Rubin and most of his team moved into Google, but they weren't regular Google employees. Android got its own building with restricted access that even other Googlers couldn't get in without special permission. Page wanted Android to operate like a secret startup inside Google, fast, independent, and focused. For nearly 2 years, they worked behind closed doors, building a phone prototype called Sooner that looked a lot like a BlackBerry with a physical QWERTY keyboard and no touchscreen. The plan was to compete with BlackBerry and Windows Mobile, the kings of mobile at the time. Everything was going according to plan until January 9th, 2007, when Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and dropped a bomb that destroyed everything. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs introduced 3 revolutionary products.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator.
Then he revealed they were all the same device, the iPhone. Andy Rubin was in Las Vegas that day for the Consumer Electronics Show. He was in a car on his way to meet with phone manufacturers and carriers when someone told him Jobs was making an announcement. Rubin pulled up the webcast on his phone, and as Jobs revealed the iPhone, Rubin's face went white. He told his driver to pull over immediately so he could watch the rest of the presentation. When it was over, Rubin turned to his colleague in the car and said, "Holy crap, I guess we're not going to ship that phone." Because the iPhone made their Sooner prototype look ancient. It was gorgeous, revolutionary, futuristic, while Android's prototype, with its plastic keyboard, looked like something from 1999. The entire Android team realized they were in serious trouble, but they had one card left to play. While building Sooner, they'd also been working on another prototype called Dream that had a touchscreen. Dream was nowhere near ready for release, but after seeing the iPhone, Rubin made the call to scrap Sooner completely and bet everything on Dream. They'd have to rebuild Android from scratch to compete with Apple, and the stakes were higher than ever. It would take 18 months of brutal work, but they had no choice. In November 2007, Google made their move and announced the Open Handset Alliance, a coalition of companies including HTC, Motorola, Qualcomm, T-Mobile, and Samsung. Yes, the same Samsung that laughed Rubin out of the boardroom 3 years earlier. The alliance had one goal: develop and promote Android as a free, open-source operating system. This was Google's big bet, and their strategy was the opposite of Apple's. Instead of controlling everything like Apple, they would give Android away for free. Any manufacturer could use it, modify it, build with it, because the more Android phones in the world, the more people would use Google search and see Google ads. On September 23, 2008, the first Android phone, the T-Mobile G1, also called the HTC Dream, launched with Android 1.0 installed. It wasn't as pretty as the iPhone, but it had potential. Critics weren't impressed at first, but Google kept improving Android. They released new versions every year, each one better than the last. Like when Android 2.0 brought Google Maps navigation and Android 4.0 unified tablets and phones. By 2010, Android had captured 17.2% of the handset market, overtaking Apple for the first time. The growth didn't stop, as by 2013, Android powered 72% of smartphones in the US and Europe. On the side, Steve Jobs watched Android's rise with fury. In his biography, he called it a betrayal and made it clear he thought Google stole Apple's ideas. He threatened to go thermonuclear on Android and vowed to destroy it, believing that Android was a blatant copy, and he wanted revenge. But it was a little too late. Today, Android runs 72% of all smartphones globally, as well as in watches, cars, TVs, tablets, everywhere. All while the iPhone sits at around 27%. The irony is thick, because Apple gave Andy Rubin his start in Silicon Valley, the experience and the nickname that would define his career. They taught him about hardware, software, and how to think differently about technology. And then they watched as he used all that knowledge to build their biggest competitor. If you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We've got more stories like this coming your way.